dots mean the runs were going down. And the bigger the dot, the more they were going down. The green dots are the runs were going up. Starting in 1990, something began to happen to your fish. Prior to that, there really is no pattern. There were some surges and a little bit of a decline, but mostly everybody stayed the same. But starting here, all of these guys started to go down, and those guys started to go up. That green line is the Harrison. And pre-spawn mortality became enormous. Now, I'm going to tell you that green line is the Harrison, and they migrate down to the south by Victoria. Everybody that was in the orange is migrating north by Campbell River. How do we know that? Because DFO has gone out and taken samples of those fish and checked their DNA. The DNA of the green run is never found among the salmon carps. Now, the pre-spawn mortality, millions of fish dying on the side of the river before they spawned, also began in the 1990s. By 2001, as many as 90% of some stocks were dying as en route. So after mission, before the spawning grounds, up to 90% were dying, and then another 10 to 30% were dying at the spawning grounds. Prior to 1995, these numbers were much, much lower, rarely exceeded 20%. In 2002, $72 million were lost to commercial fishermen just to pre-spawn mortality. So, huge economic loss. What I learned in reading the Cohen documents is a lot of biologists within DFO were extremely alarmed by this. They were going to spawning grounds, checking the fish, and virtually nobody had spawned. And I read their emails. They were not supported by DFO. They didn't have enough money for couriers. The entire Nadina run was lost in 2008. They had 3 gill arches that were rotten, and they were very angry about this. They had no backup on how to deal with it. And here's some of their words. They call them bleeders. I don't know if you guys have run into this, but they said you just touch these fish and they start bleeding. Definitely something out of the ordinary in describing the sockeye from the upper Pitt River. Possibly the worst looking gills I've ever seen. The lesions are unique, severe inflammation, the mystery deepens. We're finding everything but the kitchen sink. They couldn't figure out why all these fish were dying when they looked like they were dying of different things. Now, usually when fish die, you don't get a chance to look at them, but in this case they were able to look at them because they were right there on the riverbank. But because salmon always die in the river, nobody really noticed. There wasn't huge alarm bells. It wasn't like looking out over a bay and seeing, millions of dead pilchard. It wasn't obvious. But DFO got worried. They never helped the biologists that were up in the rivers, but they decided they had to give it an allocation. DFO goes up into Johnson Straits, they do a test set, and they take DNA of the fish, and they go, okay, we got 90% Weaver, Cultus, Cornell, bang, let's open a fishery. But they couldn't do that anymore because they didn't know if 90% of the Weaver were going to die. And so they tasked these women. This is Dr. Christy Miller and her all-girl lab from Nanaimo. And they are genomic scientists, which is amazing. They read our cells, and in their case, they read fish cells. In cells, there's all these switches that turn on and off as you experience life. And DFO said, predict how many fish are going to die. When we do a test set in Johnson Straits, we want to know what percentage of the Weaver or the Quenelle are going to die before they spawn. Unbelievably, they figured it out. And what they came up with is this virus that's called salmon leukemia. It is a work in progress. It's a difficult story, but this is the pattern. What they found was the switches were all the same in the fish that were dying, and then the ones that were surviving had another pattern. So that meant there was one problem that was causing all the fish to die. Salmon leukemia weakens the immune system of the fish, like AIDS. It's a retrovirus. And so they didn't actually die of salmon leukemia, they died of everything. They came in weak. She said the dying sockeye all had the same pattern. It was consistent with a retroviral infection, a class of viruses that often cause cancer. When I stumbled on this PowerPoint of hers, I tell you, I was shocked. An epidemic of a novel cancer-causing virus might be associated with the wild salmon declines in BC. DFO knew all about this virus. They had named it. In the early 90s, they wrote a number of papers about this disease. And what they said was, it's an important disease of the seawater weir Chinook salmon. So the fish farm industry in British Columbia started with Chinook salmon, and they put them in the Fraser sockeye migration route, and they began to die like flies of this salmon leukemia. They named it, they measured it, they said it's got to be a virus. It started in 1988 with seashell. It's a new disease. Discovery Island, so that's your migration route of the Fraser sockeye, was positive in 1992. Some farms, 100% of the fish died. It was a primary reason for financial failure of the farms, and that's why they switched to Atlantics. They kept farming Chinook in that area, but the majority of farms switched to Atlantics. They never really told the public very much about this, because who wants to eat a fish with an infectious form of cancer? Now, one scientist said that this spreading infectious neoplastic, that means causes tumor disease, could have profound regulatory effects on the salmon farming industry. But those regulatory effects never happened. So basically what they said was, oh dear, this is a serious disease, and there should be some regulations put into place, basically to separate it from the wild fish, or to get rid of this altogether out of our food supply. But nobody did anything. So here's seashell, and we're down over here. This is the Strait of Georgia, Johnson Straits. This is where I live, and that's where those are the salmon farms, and I think this is the critical spot for your fish. These are the Discovery Islands. These are very narrow channels through here with all these farms on them. There's no way for the fish to get through anymore without going through them. And when we heard talks by the scientists at DFO, they said that when the viruses pour out of these farms, they fill the channels. 7 trillion viral particles per farm a day when they have an outbreak. And here come your fish, and they're swimming through that, and by the time they get through, they have ingested whatever came out of those farms. There's no way they could get through there without passing over their gills what's coming out of the farms. Well, what's coming out of the farms might not always be dangerous, but if it is dangerous, it's in their bloodstream. DFO got a little worried, and they did a study to see what happens to the Fraser sockeye when this gets in their body. And what they found out was, after 10 weeks of exposure to this leukemia, all of the sockeyes and all of the Chinook became infected, and all the sockeye died, and most of the Chinook.
What year were those reports written?
95. And this man, Michael Kent, was the director of the Pacific Biological Station. He wrote that paper. He did that work. He did the study that found out that when the sockeye salmon were exposed to this disease, they all died. And yet, when he wrote his report for Justice Cohen, he said, yeah, disease caused severe anemia, it's usually lethal, but he put it as a low risk to the sockeye salmon. I don't think that was an honest appraisal of that virus. 100% of the sockeye infected. It's usually lethal. And the first generation of Fraser sockeye that went by those salmon farms are the ones that began the decline. And when Dr. Miller starts looking at salmon, she doesn't have this in her mind. The last thing this woman wants to run into is salmon farming in her career, because in DFO that is not good for your career. And her compass is all over, and pretty soon it's just like, boing, right on salmon leukemia, which it turns out is probably going to get a different name because DFO never finished their work on this virus. They never sequenced it. They never gave anybody a roadmap. They never took a picture of it. So it's very hard to trace it, and it will probably end up being the parvovirus. So this is another graph just to show you. These are the green guys. These are the green dots. This is the Harrison. And since the 90s, they've been increasing. And here's all your other fish. They've been going down, and those are the ones going this way. And they're passing approximately 9.6 million fish every time they go out, farm fish. So Dr. Miller, she was careful about this. She didn't really want to mention salmon farms, but finally in April of 2010, she said, I want to test those salmon farms, see if the same disease is in the sockeyes in the salmon farms. Not so fast. This is why Anissa and I test farm salmon in supermarkets, because you're not allowed to go to these farms and test their fish. Even though this woman, she's figured it out, but DFO wouldn't let her test the fish, basically put tape over her mouth, and wouldn't let her talk to the media. When 10 million Fraser sockeye went missing, Ottawa muzzled scientists. And the only Fraser sockeye that do not pass salmon farms have been named the salmon stronghold. My sense is the fish are talking, but we can't hear them. So everybody says, great theory, Alex, but what about 2010? We had that historic, amazing run of salmon. And I wondered that too. So there I have all these records in the Cohen inquiry, and I thought, I wonder how many Chinook salmon with salmon leukemia were left on the migration route of the Fraser sockeye. And here's what happened. Dr. Miller begins to discover, this is just the number of Chinook on the Fraser sockeye migration route. The Atlantics are still way up here. They've got other issues, but Miller starts her work here, and by 2008, the salmon farming industry quietly removed all of those Chinook farms with the salmon leukemia history, and that is the same year that the 2010ers went to sea. The fish that came back in 2010 went to sea in 2008. The first run of Fraser sockeye that went to sea without being exposed to salmon leukemia and Chinook farms came back in historic numbers. They bounced right back up to where they were before. Unbelievable fish. It's hard not to admire this animal just for its sheer ability to rebound. And so that's, when I see that, same thing happened with the Broughton, and I won't go through that story, but they rebounded when they took them off the migration route. This pressure that the fish farms are putting on these wild salmon, they can't survive it, but for the moment, they seem able to bounce back. And I think these salmon were trying to come home to us every single year. It's hard to see it any other way.